Okay, we have been hearing about the Hennepin County Specialty Courts for almost 2 years, starting with Judge Lois Conroy's presentation. You can laugh at me, Namdi, and Holly if you want to. Okay, Judge Lois Conroy's presentation. Since then, city and county attorneys have, as they go through our old court watch lists, mentioned how much they hope to get a defendant accepted by one or another specialty court. I've asked several attorneys why they recommend this strategy and got vague answers, really. Mostly they pointed to closer supervision or extra kinds of help, but we've never had time for them to detail what close supervision looked like or
Really? What'd you get?
extra kinds of help. So the specialty court that the attorneys seem to wish for the hardest is Veterans Court. And it's very, very clear that this particular court is really very highly regarded by the county and city attorneys both. So when I heard about Mr. Hunter and his impact on court proceedings and outcome, I asked him to join us and explain how his work shapes outcomes for people who need redirection. And here he is, Brock Hunter, who is still muted.
Well, thank you, Emily. I appreciate the invite. I think it's interesting that Judge Conroy is the one who first introduced this idea to you all. She and I went to law school at the University of Minnesota together, and we're classmates, so small world. I'm going to share my PowerPoint here with you all, and we'll get rolling. All right. Do you see that first slide, everyone?
We do.
All right. So I was happy to get this invite to speak to you all tonight and in your interest in specialty courts and in particular in Veterans Court. And by way of a little bit of background, my work with veterans in the criminal justice system really started with my own military service 30 odd years ago. I served as a Army recon scout and sniper and struggled a bit with integration when I came back from my service experience. And fortunately, I found my way through it and ended up graduating from college and then law school at the University of Minnesota. And ultimately have been practicing here in Minneapolis, primarily in the area of criminal defense ever since. I devote a pretty significant portion of my law practice to working with veterans in the criminal courts. And then outside of that practice, I'm also the co-founder of a nonprofit called the Veterans Defense Project that focuses on public policy, education, and advocacy to try to help ensure that our criminal justice system, not just here in Minnesota, but across the country, does a better job this time around with our current generation of veterans than we have with past generations. Here in Minnesota, I helped to pass Minnesota's original veteran sentencing legislation back in 2008. I helped to found the Hennepin County Veterans Court, which was the first in the state in 2010 and 11, and then have helped to found the rest of the dozen or so veterans courts that we now have across the state, across Minnesota. And as we'll get to towards the end of my presentation, I'm also the co-author of a new piece of legislation that's currently making its way through the legislature here in Minnesota that is essentially version 2.0 of our original veteran sentencing statute. And what I hope to do tonight is talk to you a little bit about why we see so many veterans coming into the criminal courts, to talk a little bit about what combat trauma looks like from the perspective of a troubled veteran who's not getting a lot of help, and how the court system is already doing a better job with veterans than we have with past generations, and how we can do even better. We, over the past couple of years, have been pulling back from our national focus to really focusing on working here in Minnesota in our own backyard on what we call our Minnesota mission. And we define that as to improve the way the Minnesota justice system deals with troubled veterans, increasing the understanding of the nature of combat trauma, its ties to criminal behavior, and how criminal charges can serve as an intervention opportunity to leverage a veteran into needed treatment and help them become assets again, rather than ongoing liabilities to the communities that they risk their lives to protect. And as we travel around Minnesota talking about this issue, we talk about the coming storm and the fact that we're seeing escalating numbers of veterans coming into our criminal courts in Minnesota and across the country, and highlighting that history tells us that this trend is going to continue for the foreseeable future, creating an increasing public health and public safety threat unless we do more to address it. And I want to start this conversation by talking a little bit about the historical perspective and the unique situation that we're in with this current generation of combat veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And I'll contrast the current generation with the Vietnam generation, our last major generation of war veterans. And note that according to government's own statistics, of the 3 million or so Americans who served in the Vietnam War, 1 to 1.5 million suffered long-term psychological issues related to their service. And according to a study done by the VA in the mid-1980s, roughly a decade after the Vietnam War ended, half of the veterans that the VA was treating at that time for post-traumatic stress disorder had some contact with the criminal justice system. Half of them had been arrested at least one time. That same study found that over a third had been arrested 2 or more times, and nearly 12% had been convicted of felonies in just that first decade after the war. These are statistics far outside of the civilian norm. And of course, Vietnam veterans came home to, in many cases, a pretty unwelcoming homecoming. They were famously spit on and called baby killers. And that demonization was never more apparent than when they came home and acted out in their communities and found themselves in the criminal justice system. Department of Justice studies that have been done over the years since Vietnam have confirmed that Vietnam veterans were treated more harshly in the American criminal court system than civilians who were committing the same crimes during that period. And those lock 'em up policies that we saw with the Vietnam generation continue to reverberate today. Today, 40 plus years after the Vietnam War, we still have hundreds of thousands of Vietnam era veterans who are chronically homeless, incarcerated, and addicted across America. And the suicide rate among the Vietnam generation is a highly controversial topic, and we'll never know exactly how many Vietnam vets took their own lives after the war. But most experts agree that at least as many died by their own hand after the war as died in the war itself, around 60,000. Many, including many Vietnam veterans groups, argue the numbers are actually higher than that. Some argue as high as 150,000, especially when you include drug overdoses and other wantonly self-destructive behavior. And when you turn to look at the current generation of veterans coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, we're starting to see pretty similar patterns in the statistics. The National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine released a study in 2012 that found at that point 2.6 million Americans had served in Iraq or Afghanistan. That number is now well over 3 million, so more than served in Vietnam. But of that 2.6 million, the National Academy estimated around 500,000 or so suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, another 500,000 or so suffering from traumatic brain injury, and most importantly, they acknowledge that these numbers are almost certainly on the low end of the reality of what we're facing. They noted that those suffering from these types of invisible injuries are very reluctant to raise their hand and ask for help. And so these numbers are almost certainly on the low end. We also talk about the important role that American women have served in these current conflicts. Over 300,000 have now served in the war zones in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're serving in combat roles this time around like never before. In fact, as of this past year, there are no jobs in the US military that are off limits to women. We have women taking command of infantry platoons in the Army and the Marine Corps and are in the training pipeline to become Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and Army Rangers. And they're suffering right alongside the men in pretty much equal proportion. The VA estimates 20% of women who served in the war zones have a PTSD diagnosis. And we also note that it's not just combat exposure that brings women into the VA with post-traumatic stress, but also what we call military sexual trauma. They have been raped by a peer or a superior. Someone they are supposed to be able to entrust their lives in has betrayed them on the most fundamental level, creating a special kind of trauma. And many of the women that we see coming through the court system, through our veterans courts, whether they've seen combat or not, end up reporting at some point that they were victims of military sexual trauma. Huge issue that the military is just beginning to address. The great concern that we face today with this generation of veterans is the multiple deployments that we're doing this time around that many experts agree is going to lead to probably the highest rates of post-traumatic stress of any generation we've ever deployed overseas into combat. Contrasting today to Vietnam, in Vietnam we had a draft, and with that draft we served many more Americans to serve and spread the burden of the fighting out over many more shoulders. Draftees in Vietnam served one 12-month tour in combat, and then their obligation was up and most went home. In fact, 90+% of Vietnam veterans served just one tour. Contrast that to today, without a draft and with the smallest military per capita we've fielded in any conflict, we have fought the two longest wars in our country's history. And we've done it by recycling the same troops back into combat over and over and over in a way we've never done before in our country's history. Today, it is commonplace to find veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan who have served 2 or 3 combat tours, not just in the active duty forces, but even in the Guard and the Reserve. I've long ago lost count of how many Minnesota Guard members we've represented in my practice who've had 2 or more combat deployments. It's just very, very common today. And within the active duty combat, ground combat forces, the Army and Marine Corps in particular, we're seeing many more, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 full year-long deployments have been reported by the Department of Defense among some of our troops. And within the special operations community, the Navy SEALs, Green Berets, Army Rangers, et cetera, who serve at the very tip of the spear during these conflicts, we're seeing even more deployments. These folks tend to do shorter, usually 6-month deployments, but they are much more intensely violent on average than the conventional forces. And these folks are going over and coming back and going over and coming back, and are now up into the teens, and for some of them, even over 20 combat deployments since 9/11. We have never deployed individuals into combat for as long or as often as these folks. And why is this important? Well, the military's own studies today not only confirm the reality of combat trauma as a legitimate battlefield injury, but confirm also that the rates of post-traumatic stress climb significantly with each additional deployment. We now realize very clearly this is an exposure injury, and the more combat you're exposed to, the more you're likely you are to suffer. This political cartoon from back to the height of the Iraq War, I think, does a great job of symbolizing this unprecedented strain that we're putting on our troops. I think it's notable that in this particular cartoon, it's a National Guardsman struggling under the weight of these multiple rucksacks. It's also notable that he's not complaining about the weight. And it's really critically important for people to understand the culture of the military is it's a warrior culture. It's a culture of service and self-sacrifice that doesn't really have a parallel in the civilian world. Then the military culture, from the day that you start boot camp until the day you leave, you're indoctrinated with this idea that your own personal well-being is a secondary or less priority to taking care of the troops around you and completing the mission. You really are programmed to think about yourself last. And that selflessness follows many veterans into the civilian world. And I think is a big barrier to many of them raising their hand and asking for help when they need it. And why so often we identify a veteran in need of help in the back of a squad car or down at the county jail. Here are some real world analogs of the soldier in that political cartoon. You can see that wear and tear pretty clearly on their faces. Oh, sorry. I don't know why this is looping. Go back through. Here we go. So the good news is, I think as a country over the last 40+ years, we've learned some lessons from the Vietnam War and its aftermath. Today, whether or not we support the current conflicts, we don't blame the troops like we did after Vietnam, thankfully. We seem to have collectively as a country come to the recognition that it's elected leaders who are responsible for deploying troops into combat, not the men and women in uniform who are selflessly carrying out orders. In a healthy democracy, we've learned that we don't want a politicized military that decides what fights it's going to fight and what fights it's not. If you look at countries around the world throughout history who have politicized militaries, you find countries with military coups and dictatorships in pretty short order. So today, we support our troops, whether or not we support the war, right? At least that's what the bumper stickers say. And our goal in this advocacy is to take that support our troops mentality, laudable as it is, and ensure that it goes beyond bumper stickers and yellow ribbons around trees to real enduring support for our troops as they come home and struggle to reintegrate back into their communities. Among the veterans that we work with in the courts, we hear a refrain over and over in various ways. It's not a hostile public that they're coming home to, like those troops after Vietnam, and they're thankful for that. But there's a frustration among today's veterans that they're coming home to an apathetic and disconnected public, a public that's not really paying attention to these wars to the extent that we ever were. As one of my clients said, I come home and I look at the news and I see a very censored and Clorox bleached, sanitized version of the war, cleansed of all of the blood and all of the horror and everything that would help the public better understand why so many of us come home and struggle to move on with our lives. That sentiment that I've heard so often, I think, is best symbolized by a piece of graffiti from the Iraq War. This was found on a concrete blast wall at a US base in Ramadi, Iraq, left behind by some anonymous Marine. It said, "America is not at war. The US Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall." And that is the sentiment that I hear over and over again in various ways from my clients and other veterans we see coming through the system. They just have a sense that no one knows, no one cares what they've been through, what they have done, what they've sacrificed on our behalf. They don't know how to even begin talking about what they've experienced, and so they shut down and they self-isolate. And we know that that isolation in the context of untreated trauma is a killer, and it often leads into a downward spiral of self-medication and acting out that ultimately lands these folks in the criminal justice system. So I'm going to share some images and some statistics from the real war. Some of them are a bit graphic, and I don't share them with you gratuitously, but I think it's important that we have at least a glimpse of what these real wars, the real war looks like, beyond what we're seeing in our newspapers and mainstream media coverage. And along with these images comes some statistics to give us a sense of the types of combat exposure that our troops are coming home with. A lot of people that I've encountered over the years of doing this advocacy are under the impression that because we've only lost 7,000 or so troops in these wars, as compared to 60,000 in Vietnam and hundreds of thousands in the world wars, that these are somehow less violent or less horrific wars. And I always remind people that our casualty statistics today have a lot more to do with high-tech body armor and vehicle armor and amazing battlefield medicine that's keeping troops alive from injuries that would have killed them in past conflicts. Without these new technologies, our casualty statistics would be far higher. And the fact is that these wars have been incredibly brutally violent, and the fighting is very up close and personal. And the trauma associated with it is really hard to even wrap our minds around. The statistics I'm citing here come from a study done by the US Army on infantry troops returning from their first deployment to Iraq early on in the war. And of those troops in their one tour, 94% reported they had received incoming small arms fire. Someone had directly tried to kill them. 48% reported they had personally killed an enemy combatant. They'd committed an act that here in America we would call murder. 51% had personally handled human remains. And 28%, and this is the one that got me, nearly a third reported they were personally responsible for the death of a non-combatant, a woman, a child, someone not actively involved in the fight, but who was nonetheless caught in the crossfire. And before we judge these veterans for the innocent blood they come home with on their hands, we need to remember that these have been insurgent conflicts where the enemy doesn't wear uniforms and they don't line up to fight on the battlefield. Instead, they launch attacks on our troops from often heavily populated urban areas, knowing that our return fire will kill innocents and hoping it will help their political cause. These have also been conflicts in which the enemy uses suicide bombing tactics as a weapon of choice to overcome our technological superiority. And this creates a huge amount of uncertainty for troops in the war zone because anyone approaching them on foot or in a vehicle could be a suicide bomber prepared to take their own lives in order to take American lives. It creates a huge amount of uncertainty and having to make impossible calls on a second's notice. As one of my clients so articulately said, he said, in Baghdad in 2006, at the height of the surge, we were doing foot patrols in heavily populated city center areas surrounded by crowds of people, any one of whom could have been a suicide bomber prepared to take their own life to kill us. And so we were constantly scanning the crowds, looking into the eyes and into the hearts of everyone around us, trying to determine their intent. Friend, foe, friend, foe, friend, foe. And as I'll never forget, he said, mistake a foe for a friend and you're dead. Your buddies are dead. Mistake a friend for a foe and kill them, and you're burdened with guilt for the rest of your life. You've got a quarter of a second to decide over and over and over. Friend, foe, friend, foe, friend, foe. And when the wrong call is made and innocent blood is shed, the guilt associated with that can be overwhelming for the veterans involved. In fact, military psychologists have come up with a special term during these conflicts called moral injury, a special kind of trauma suffered by those who believe that they have done something morally wrong. 68% of those troops surveyed had seen injured or dead American troops. These are definitely images I don't share with you lightly, but exactly the kinds of images that burn themselves into the psyche of the veterans who witnessed them personally, particularly when it was their best friends who were injured or killed. And finally, 86% reported they had lost a friend, someone they knew personally had been injured or killed in combat. As you process these images and the statistics that I've just shared with you, keep in mind that you're seeing them here in the safety of Minneapolis, Minnesota on your computer screen, not in the 120-degree heat of Baghdad, loaded down with 100 pounds of body armor, weapons, and ammunition, reverberations of explosions rocking through your body, the screams of injured and dying ringing in your ears, the smell of blood, burnt flesh, and cordite in your nose, and the knowledge that you yourself could be killed at any moment or that you're responsible for the deaths and the carnage that you've seen in these images. When you start to think about it in this context, you start to sense what combat trauma, what post-traumatic stress is like. It's like an endless film strip of not just images, but smells, sounds, sensations, and emotions that just keep playing in your head without stop. No wonder in my mind that many veterans who are not being treated for their trauma resort to self-medication with alcohol or drugs, just to try to find a moment's peace, an hour of sleep without nightmares. And that is, in fact, how untreated trauma leads veterans into the court system. They're self-medicating, they're falling into self-destructive, reckless, and sometimes even violent behaviors against the communities that they just risked their lives to protect. Occasionally, we'll see veterans with acute PTSD suffering dissociative episodes, commonly called flashbacks, where they're reliving a combat experience as if it's happening in the moment. Very dangerous circumstances for all involved. We've had a lot of episodes across Minnesota over the last 20 years in which young veterans returning from these conflicts have ended up in armed standoffs with the police. In many cases, dissociated and believing that the police are actually enemy combatants. We're also recognizing that modern military training and conditioning, when a veteran is not getting properly treated, and particularly when they're self-medicating with alcohol and drugs, that modern military training and conditioning, which is more effective at turning our kids into warriors than ever before, can also trigger them to be conditioned to respond to a perceived threat with violence. something that I don't think is a problem among veterans who are not suffering untreated trauma and not self-medicating. But when they're in a bad place, that military training and conditioning can enhance the level of violence that they respond to a threat with and get them into all that much more trouble. Historically, there's a lot of scholarship going on around this issue, and we now know that trauma has been around as long as there has been war, as long as bad things have happened to people. Scholarship right now is going back as far as the Greek classics. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, written 3,000 years ago, are full of depictions of combat trauma exactly the way it manifests in modern veterans today. And we're also seeing scholarship that shows clear veteran committed crime waves after every major conflict, not just here in the United States, but all around the world where these studies are done. We find that a significant percentage of veterans bring their war home with them, and on one level or another end up at war with the communities that they've just fought to protect. The Civil War has a lot of data in this regard, and the prisons in the United States filled up with veterans fresh off the battlefield in the wake of the Civil War. And in fact, it was the treatment of those veterans in the prisons that led to the first prison reform movements in the United States, as the wives and mothers of these incarcerated veterans petitioned the government for better treatment of their family members, arguing that but for their experiences in the war, they would not be incarcerated. We also recognize that it was Civil War veterans who put the wild in the Wild West, and all of the outlaw gunslingers that we grew up hearing about, turns out, were Civil War veterans who migrated west after the war. All except Billy the Kid. I don't know what his problem was, but all the rest that I've been able to find in my research, turns out were veterans who had seen a significant amount of combat, and their gunslinging behavior followed them from the war out west. We saw similar patterns after World War I and II. And after World War II in particular, we recognize that the outlaw motorcycle culture that thrives across the United States today has its roots in returning World War II veterans who came home, bought surplus motorcycles from the war, and started these clubs that grew and proliferated across the United States throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And then as the Vietnam generation came home, they recruited from their ranks as well. And the same thing is happening all over again today with modern veterans. The most modern data that we have that ties untreated combat trauma to criminal behavior, ironically, comes from the military itself. And I say ironically because the military has traditionally been pretty much in denial about combat trauma. And we have to relearn these lessons all over again with each new conflict. But those days are over, at least this time around. And the military, as I stated earlier, is doing studies that confirms the reality of combat trauma as a legitimate battlefield injury. And now their own studies are even confirming ties to aberrant and criminal behavior. And this study that I'm referring to comes from Fort Carson, Colorado, a study done by the US Army in 2009. This is called the Epidemiological Consultation, or EPICON study. Fort Carson, like every other American base fielding ground combat troops into Iraq and Afghanistan, saw a significant spike in violent crimes being committed by troops returning from the war zones who were acting out on base and in the communities around their bases. Fort Carson got a lot of attention in 2008 because one of its 2,000-man combat brigades returned from its second deployment in Iraq, and within 12 months was responsible for over a dozen homicides and hundreds of violent assaults. So the US Army, who is already gearing up to do a study on this issue, sent their team of epidemiologists from Walter Reed Army Hospital out to Fort Carson to do this study. And with COVID raging, you all probably know what epidemiology is. Before COVID, I had to explain it. That's a statistical modeling science that is typically used to study the spread of diseases through a population. And in this case, the contagion in question was violence. And the team was tasked with determining why some troops were returning from the combat zones and acting out violently while others were not. One of the first things that the EPICON team studied is what they called the bad seed theory, the idea and the old excuse of military commanders that those acting out were the bad seeds, those who were going to get in trouble whether they had served in the military or not. They quickly ruled out the bad seed theory as having no statistical validity. They found two common denominators, in fact, that best predicted who was going to come home and bring their war home with them and act out against the community. And that was the number of combat deployments and the intensity of the combat in those deployments. Those were the two factors that spelled out the likelihood for trouble. And again, the reason why the multiple deployments that we're doing this time around is of such great concern in this context. So what are we doing about this? And how can we do a better job this time around than we did with past generations? Well, as I said, in 2008, we passed Minnesota's original veteran sentencing legislation, making us just the second state in the country to have anything on the books that encouraged the courts to consider military service in criminal sentencing. I was part in drafting this bill. And when we first passed it, a lot of what I considered the best features of the bill had been taken out during the context of the legislative process. And what we ended up with was what I felt a fairly anemic bill that wasn't really giving judges any particular powers to do anything. And I wasn't sure it was going to have a lot of beneficial impact. Fortunately, I was wrong. It started a conversation, and it opened the eyes of prosecutors and judges to this issue, and it opened the door to a lot of positive things that followed. One of those was a US Supreme Court decision called Porter v. McCullum that was handed down the very next year in 2009. And this was the first time the US Supreme Court had ever addressed military combat trauma in criminal sentencing. And this was a death penalty case out of the state of Florida. The veteran George Porter had been sentenced to death after brutally killing his ex-girlfriend and her boyfriend in a drunken rage in the 1980s. And his attorneys at trial did not make any effort to enter into evidence his military service or resulting trauma. And the jury and the judge never knew what George had done on behalf of his country. And as a result, he was sentenced to death. And it was only years later on appeal that his attorneys found his military records and tracked down men he had served with in the war and family members to testify about all of the changes they had seen him in the years after he had come home. And ultimately, the Supreme Court overturned his death penalty, finding that it would be relevant to a jury to know about his military service experience and how it impacted him. And in the heart of their decision, they cited in a footnote to Minnesota's veteran sentencing statute, along with California, the other state that had passed one at that time. And in the wake of that decision, we here in Minnesota that had helped pass our statute were contacted by people in many other states seeking assistance in passing similar legislation of their own. And that is where the nonprofit or the Veterans Defense Project really got its start. We formalized our advocacy and founded this nonprofit and published a book on working with veterans in the court system and helped a number of state pass statutes, many of them identical to Minnesota's. And then over the decades since then, we've helped states, in many states, pass, frankly, better laws than we have here in Minnesota, taking advantage of the hard lessons that we learned working in the trenches with veterans over the last 10 years. And one of the things that we've been doing that has really taken off are veterans courts. As Emily indicated, specialty courts are I think, a growing area within the criminal justice system, and veterans courts are a key part of it. Specialty courts, in essence, they're like drug courts, DWI courts, mental health courts, are all about addressing the underlying mental health or substance abuse issue that is driving the criminal conduct, that is bringing people often repeatedly into the criminal courts, rather than just punishing the behavior. The idea is that if you invest the resources on the front end in helping the offender get back on top of their mental health or substance abuse issues, they won't keep coming back over and over and over again, like so many people who are not properly treated do. We started our first veterans court, as I noted, in 2010, right here in Hennepin County, and we have since helped launch a little over a dozen more veterans courts across the state. But we have 87 counties in Minnesota, and the vast majority of counties still do not have a veterans court type of program. And those who do have very different kinds of veterans courts. There is not a lot of uniformity in our veterans courts across Minnesota. They have different models, they have different criteria for what kinds of offenses they will allow, and they have very different outcomes for the veterans who participate. Most specialty courts across the country in Minnesota operate on the philosophy that you're offering the offender a legal incentive to get involved in the specialty court and subject themselves to the intense scrutiny, the increased requirements for treatment and accountability, by giving them an opportunity to avoid the criminal conviction that they're otherwise facing and to avoid the jail time that they're otherwise facing. That if they focus on getting themselves better, they're going to walk away from this process without the conviction and without the jail time whenever possible. Well, unfortunately, that's not true across the board. And some specialty courts, including some veterans courts, do convict the veterans involved. Some of them do give them jail time in addition to the increased treatment and accountability that they're requesting of them. And when that happens, we find that the stakeholders in those jurisdictions, their buy-in on this starts to decline. The number of veterans or participants in other specialty courts starts to go down because they're not really incentivized to come in and really engage. And that was happening in Minnesota. And that was the reason that we started this Minnesota mission that I referred to earlier over the last couple of years, was concerned that our veterans courts were starting to fail. The state public defenders pulled out of the veterans courts in 2017 because of the disparities across the veterans courts as to how veterans were being treated. And without public defender buy-in, we were seeing the remaining veterans courts, even the good ones, were starting to really struggle without having that key component in the system. And so we sought and received a grant from the state of Minnesota and put together a working group of judges and county attorneys, including Mike Freeman here in Minneapolis and his chief deputy, Dave Brown, as well as the Ramsey County attorney, Washington County attorney. We also brought in the state public defenders and the VA and the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we had monthly meetings up at the Supreme Court over a period of 2 years, arguing over what works and what doesn't work in our veterans courts and coming up with an agreed upon set of best practices. The solution is what we call the veterans. And here's our working group. I'm sorry, I forgot this slide. So here, Judge Carolina Lamas, one of our veterans court judges from here in Hennepin County, was also part of this. But really a great group of stakeholders from across the system who really, I think, brought an amazing amount of expertise to bear. And we focused really heavily on what we call the disposition issue. As I said, what is the legal incentive that we're using to attract veterans into the program, to get them on board with the idea of going off to the VA and subjecting themselves to trauma therapies that they, frankly, in many cases, don't really want to get involved in, and to subject themselves to the additional scrutiny that a veterans court brings on them. And ideally, again, we believe strongly that the best practice here is to give the veteran an opportunity to earn their way out of having a criminal conviction, particularly a felony conviction that is going to really hamper their further reintegration back into their communities. It's going to make them a permanent second-class citizen who's never really fully going to be able to achieve their potential. In which, in my experience with many veterans I've worked with over the years, those convictions, particularly felony convictions, often erode any progress that the veteran makes during their time in the veterans court, and they end up falling back into the same kinds of issues that brought them into the courts in the first place, and they started to recidivate. So pre-conviction adjudication is a big part of what we're advocating. We argue that it recognizes the service and sacrifice of the veterans on behalf of their communities. It helps reestablish often broken trust between the veterans and their government and communities. It incentivizes them to commit to getting this trauma treatment that can be so effective. And it gives them an offer of redemption and the ability to once again be an asset and not an ongoing liability into their communities. And in the process, we really do believe that it protects public safety in both the short and the long term. These best practices that we came up with as the working group have been embodied in this legislation that is now pending in the Minnesota legislature. We call it the Veterans Restorative Justice Act. And what it does is it identifies a class of offenses, and these are essentially offenses that come with a presumptive probation term. If it is a presumptive prison term, they are not included unless it is by agreement with the prosecutor and the judge, and in some cases it will be. But it focuses on those offenses that are presumptive probation. So these are folks that are going to be in the community, they're going to be in the courts, and so we're funneling them into this paradigm. They have to enter a guilty plea. They have to take responsibility for themselves. They can't be pointing fingers at anybody else, saying it's somebody else's fault, somebody else's problem. They enter the guilty plea, and that plea figuratively goes in the judge's pocket during the time that they're on probation. This will standardize, if passed, this approach in every county in Minnesota. All of our existing veterans courts will operate on the same set of parameters, so we won't have the disparities in treatment across the veterans courts that the public defenders cause them to leave participation in the veterans courts. The public defenders will all come back. It will also apply to counties that don't have a veterans court. As I said, we only have a dozen or so veterans courts in Minnesota, and majority of counties out there still don't have any kind of programming. And this law would, if passed, apply to any judge in any county in Minnesota that has an individual veteran in front of them to take a veterans court type of approach in that case, and to incentivize the veteran to get help, to hold them accountable, ensure that they get the help that they need. And then if they complete everything that's expected of them, and at the end of the process, everybody is satisfied with how the veteran has done in the program and is no longer considered a threat to public safety, the judge can take that plea back out of her pocket, tear it up figuratively, vacate the plea, and dismiss the charge against the veteran, allowing them to leave the criminal court system without a criminal conviction and return to their community a full citizen who can fulfill all of their potential. So that in a nutshell is what we're trying to accomplish here. The good news is Hennepin County has a very well-functioning veterans court, and they're the original court, they're the largest court, and they're doing good things by our veterans here. We see a steady flow of veterans coming in. I just today was working with one of my veterans in the Hennepin County Court who has turned his life around after 4 combat deployments with the Army Infantry as an airborne infantryman with the 82nd Airborne Division in Iraq and Afghanistan, who was struggling mightily with alcohol and drug addiction and committed an act of domestic violence. He is now in the Hennepin County Court. He is undergoing domestic violence programming that is veteran specific, and is addressing his PTSD, and just got promoted at his job and is doing better than ever, and his family is doing better than ever. And I think he stands as a perfect example of what we're trying to accomplish here. So with that, I will open to questions, and I'm just thankful again, once again, for the opportunity to speak with you all tonight.
Well, first of all, Mr. Hunter, thank you for your service, and thank you for your continued service to veterans. I am a membership officer for American Legion Post 555, and we like to donate to causes that support veterans in any way possible. So I'm wondering, is there any way for anybody here, not just us, but any way for citizens or groups like ours to throw their support behind the Veterans Defense Project?
Oh, wow. I think you appreciate that, Larry. Yes, our website address is veteransdefenseproject.org. And you can go to our website, and there is an easy way to donate to us, and we would be grateful for any support you can offer.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Jim Benson. I appreciate very much your presentation, and I lived through part of the Vietnam era days when you couldn't walk through an airport with your uniform on very well without being accosted in some manner, shape, or form. And it's pretty difficult to take somebody who's 20 years old and put them through that kind of trauma. Luckily, I had a father who was a retired Army colonel, and I had done a lot of support, but he prepared me for everything. A lot of people weren't that lucky, and I often thought, even at the time, that how do these other guys make it through? Uh, but so I have a great feeling for that, and uh, one of the things that always looked at for years was amongst my peers was how much damage the news media, in fact, at that time did to make this problem worse. In fact, lit fire under it, and it was that was a real tragedy. Now this time around with the Iraqi and the Afghanistan veterans, that may not be so much of a problem, but there are other problems in that the end of conscription means that the base of people that actually understand what warfare is all about is limited. And World War II, everybody was involved. You had your ration stamps, you had this, that, or the other thing. Everyone was involved, and so you had skin in the game, which is not the case anymore, as you pointed out very well. And so you have these kinds of different situations, which with a professional army, the top brass guys like my dad, they celebrated this because they weren't training somebody every 2 years to do the job. On the other hand, as far as societies in general, we lost the understanding of what a nation actually is, and this is something of a conundrum that we're facing today. And I just was wondering what your thoughts might be on this and how this kind of affects the work you're doing. Um, uh, I'm not saying that your work would never have been very important, but it's more important now because we don't have these other things in our society that supports these people.
I couldn't agree more. I think, as you stated, in Vietnam, or well, World War II in particular, I think the whole country participated in World War II on every level, right? And in Vietnam, there was also more buy-in because of the draft. Anyone's kid pretty much could be drafted and sent off. So people felt more of an ownership over what was happening overseas. But today, you're right. It's a what is 1% of Americans have served in uniform during the current conflicts, and only half of that 1% have deployed. Compare that to around 16% who served during World War II. It's just a tiny fraction. And you're right. A lot of folks just don't know any veterans, don't know anybody who served over there, and the detachment is very significant. We've all, like I said, been at the mall, and that detachment is very detectable to the veterans who come home. They're just shocked at how little engagement there is with what's happening overseas, and I think it really plays a big role in their struggles to reintegrate. So yeah, these programs like we have in the criminal justice system are key to reintegration. I also am often asked, what can we do for veterans before they commit crimes and get in trouble to help them reintegrate? And I always say, well, that's really outside of my particular silo, but we do need to come up with ways across the board to re-engage and reintegrate this generation of veterans. And they have a ton to offer. These are young men and women who have lived often many lifetimes worth of life experiences and have amazing amounts of leadership training, and in some cases technical training that can be put to great work here in our communities at a time when we really need it. But so many of them come home and initially really struggle to reintegrate, and unless they get some help up off their knees and onto their feet moving forward, they're never really going to fulfill that potential as an asset.
Okay, we have a question coming from Sandra Falardo, our county attorney.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my lighting there's something wrong with my thing, but oh, here I am. Hi, everybody. Sorry, I had some problems getting through, but now I'm on. Thank you for your service, Mr. Hunter. My husband served in the military, and my father-in-law did too. And I'm a county attorney, and I've been a county attorney for a long time, and I've participated in vets court. It's a very compelling process. And I in my heart of hearts, I think that all livability crimes should be dealt with in that way. But I am wondering, because we are so out of touch about the violence that does happen during combat, in how these young men come back, what is being done to really, because I assume that a lot of these kids, when they sign up, they do it with pride, they're excited about it. But do they really, are those recruiters really telling them the risks that they're taking? I have a 23-year-old niece. She turned 23 today. She is going to she's going to enlist as an officer, I think. But I mean, my husband has been helping her through the process. And frankly, it's like they're trying to sell her something. And she's having, my husband, who he's a 50-year-old man who was in the military for a long time, advocates for her in this meeting with these recruiters with her. And it is really it's not good to see it. So is there something that can be done to prevent, the shock, and so people understand what they're getting into? Because I don't think that a lot of them do understand what they get into, and then the risks are great.
Well, you're very right, Sandra. I think that militaries throughout the ages are guilty of recruiting young people. For some reason, throughout the ages in every country, military age is 18 to 22, and that is the age by which you've matured to some extent as an adult, but you still think you're invulnerable. And that is the perfect sweet spot for militaries to recruit. And I can tell you from my experience, I had no sense of what I was really signing up for. And I saw it as a big adventure. It was a way to get out of Western South Dakota, where I had grown up, and go out and see the world. And I had seen a lot of movies that glamorized this stuff, and I wanted to go out and live that action movie. And I signed up for one of the more dangerous jobs that I possibly could have picked. And it was a shock to the system, to say the least. I think kids signing up today know they're signing up for war. We've been at war for 20 years now, so at least there's that. And I think some of them sign up fully knowing what they're signing up for, and others are really blissfully unaware. And you're right, recruiters are not spelling it out in excruciating detail. They are under a lot of pressure to recruit numbers and quotas, and to fill uniforms, and that is always the case. And I would also say the level of violence and everything that one is exposed to is going to vary dramatically from service to service and job to job. Not everybody is out there kicking down doors and shooting at people at close quarters. That varies quite a bit. But in general, yeah, I think a lot of the young people who go off to serve don't necessarily know fully what they're signing up for. And
just an interjection, just a brief
I've
interjection.
had a difficult conversation with many a veteran about how their perceptions of what they were signing up for were quite different than what they actually experienced.
Just a brief interjection. Okay, I'm Vietnam era. And one of the kids from Hutchinson who wanted to follow his brother into the Marines did so during in the middle of the Kennedy administration. He signed up for 4 in the Marines, and he was asked how he would like to deployment to the Caribbean, and he was thinking of blue skies, blue water, sugar sand beach. And about 2 weeks after he got to Guantanamo, Kennedy and Castro got into an argument And it was a very tense time, and he and everybody else who finally got out of there, got replaced. Everybody needed a vacation, and the recruiter had exactly what would probably fix them up just fine. There was this great place in Southeast Asia, beautiful country, if you don't mind the heat. And he and his buddies found themselves being called they were being sent over for an advisory position. And that was President Kennedy's Asian Advisory Corps. And my friend was patrolling the river with a buddy of his. And this was just when North Vietnam realized that Americans were sort of dumb and ignorant and prime targets for psychological warfare. And what they actually did was Bill and his buddy were patrolling the river, and they gave his buddy one bullet between the eyes and left Bill to deal with the entire situation. So, yeah, I think it's probably, he was being told he was getting a Caribbean vacation site, which he got. And then he was told about the beauties and wonders of lovely Southeast Asia, which he also got.
Yeah.
The peripherals weren't mentioned at all. I don't think it's one bit different.
There's one related thing that I often talk with folks about, and that is, with this all voluntary service and these unprecedented numbers of combat deployments we're seeing among some of our veterans, folks will say, well, they kept signing up to go back after they, were already over there once, and then they re-enlisted again and went back again and again. And so didn't they, they wanted to do these additional tours, and it leads people, I think, to be a little bit dismissive of the additional trauma these folks signed up for. And what I'll point out is, when you've gone off and done a heavy deployment or 2 or 3 in an additional enlistment period, it changes you. And I've had many veterans tell me that they came back and they realized they didn't fit in here anymore. They didn't fit into the civilian world, and the only place that they felt comfortable, the only place that they felt worthwhile, where they could contribute, was back on the battlefield. And so they'll go back again, and then they'll come back and they feel even less like they fit in here, and even less a member of their community here. And though they know they're suffering and struggling and starting to fall apart, they'll nonetheless re-enlist again, because that's where people understand them. That's where they feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, where they can contribute. They talk to buddies who get out of the military and struggle to find a job at a convenience store after having an immense amount of life and death responsibility and being in charge of millions of dollars worth of equipment and the lives of many people under their command. And they come back and there just is no analog here, and they don't fit neatly into our culture, so they keep going back. My current record in my law practice is a young veteran who did 12 combat tours as an Army Ranger, and in a 13-year career deployed overseas 12 times, a total of 5.5 years of intense combat. And he would, by his own account, still be over there. But as he said, the Army told me after my 12th deployment that I was physically and mentally broken, and they no longer required my service, and they unceremoniously medically retired me out into the world. And he struggled mightily for many years, joining an outlaw motorcycle club and following that whole pattern before landing on the doorstep of our law office. I will note, though, that he graduated from a Veterans Court program ultimately and is now in college pulling the 3.9 GPA and talking about going to graduate school. So even those extreme cases can have a positive ending if they're handled in a constructive way. And he is an amazing asset to the community. And I'm really can't wait to see what he does with all of his life experience.
Okay, if there are any questions that anybody decides they want answered in the next 5 minutes, ask it. Otherwise, send it to me and I will pass it on to Mr. Hunter. And when we put our final report out, the questions that come in 4 minutes, after 4 minutes from now,
I had a
will be at the end of
question.
his
I had a
presentation.
question, Emily. Thank you for your excellent talk, by the way, Mr. Hunter. It was excellent. And I am a product of the Vietnam War too. I had several classmates that went to Nam. As an average person who's lived in Europe and has traveled all over the world a little bit, I've lived in Europe, in Spain, and in Denmark. How do we help the image of America look better? Because they will say to me in different countries, what the heck's going on with your country? And I'll defend my country to the best of my knowledge. But it's very difficult when they're saying, why did America do the Vietnam War? Why did America do a little bit different with World War II? The average person in America, and I consider myself an average person, does not know a heck of a lot about the different wars. And that's the problem, that most of American people, the average person like me again, is not well educated. I happen to live with a husband, Nils, who knows everything about everything worldwide. He's from Denmark, Copenhagen, Denmark. But to face all these people asking me these questions is like, how do I defend the Vietnam War? I do, because my classmates were in it. I felt very close to, my goodness sakes, why is everybody being drafted? It was like terrible. We even had bomb threats in our hospitals where I was a nurse, student nurse. And I remember going from room to room to room, checking for bombs in closets and underneath beds. It was terrible. And at the same time I was in school, I graduated 71. There was a bomb that blew up in Madison and killed people from Vietnam protesters. And it's like, but I really appreciate your talk, Mr. Hunter. That was great.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I've traveled around the world as well in the years since I got out of the military, and found myself in similar conversations. And I guess it's a philosophical question that we could spend hours talking about. And I don't know how to even begin defending some of the choices the American government has made over the years, but it is an issue. And I am concerned today that our image on a international level has suffered, and I hope we find a way to earn our way back.
A lovely man in Montpellier, France, who wanted to sell me something, by the way, shopkeeper. But my French is very Franglish. It's terrible. I mean, my daughter cringes, okay? He said, you know, I love you Americans, but your presidents, where'd you find these people? He was blaming it straight on, and by the way, that was not Obama. He was way earlier than Obama. He was just bewildered about how we would follow these people and put them at the head of our government. So he had that way of dissociating. It wasn't the Americans, it was the people okay, he hadn't worked that through too well. Okay, if anybody has more questions, you have my address all over the place. And
can I just ask one really quick? All right. Hi, Brock. My name's Holly Erkey. I'm with Hennepin County Neighborhood Probation. When I was in college in 2011, a 4-star general was doing a tour on veteran services, and he was just trying to get communities to come out and show up for veterans in various ways. And I got up and I asked him, well, how do we do that? And he said, well, you start talking with people who have served and people who could now serve veterans, right, to help them rehabilitate into American culture. What areas of our community have you seen show up the most for the veterans that you serve?
Good question. You know, There's a program in Minnesota called the Yellow Ribbon Initiative, and most communities in the state have a Yellow Ribbon program that just welcomes anyone in the community to get involved, and they're involved in a variety of different ways doing outreach to veterans, and they have been great partners in helping start veterans courts in various communities across the state. So I think that'd be one entry point that seems to be a positive one. Some groups are more active in various communities than others, but they're always doing something good. But in again, I'm kind of in a specific silo of this, of criminal justice involved veterans, and I see there's a wonderful nonprofit here in Minnesota called the Minnesota Assistance Council for Veterans that helps primarily with veteran homelessness, but they've also been involved with what they call their vet law program that attracts attorneys to volunteer their time coming to legal clinics at the VA once a month. And we have a stand down event down at Fort Snelling every year, at least non-COVID years, when homeless and other veterans who are struggling in the community are invited to come to a location where all of the various community organizations and governmental organizations that serve veterans come and are on site at one place at one time. And in Hennepin County, we average anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 veterans that come through that event and get assistance. But that is another really efficient way to sort of plug the entire community into the veterans who are most in need.
Thanks.
You bet.
Is Todd available? Nick? Somebody? Nick?
Yes.
Sorry about
Yes.
that.
You know
Well,
I've got a job for you to look into, don't you? Is this something that could be somehow coordinated with the open house, assuming we have an open house?
Yeah, it's
So maybe we've got like 15 months to work on this, but okay.
yeah, we could certainly take a look at that for sure.
Mhm.
We're as we march forward with COVID, it's still very present. It's very concerning, and
Yeah.
why our meetings are online, and we're still maintaining social distancing and all that stuff. So I'm not sure if there's gonna be a police week, but it's something that we can most certainly take a look at. So
Yeah, I can tell you, Brock, that Todd Lanning is a former Marine, so I think he can identify.
Right on. Yeah. Lot of veterans in the ranks of the police and first responder community, no doubt about it.
and thank you so much.
Thank you, Brock, very, 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 very much. This is wonderful. And we will be using your information for for a long time.
And I did share some written materials with Emily that I'm sure she'll distribute to you all that'll go into more depth in all of this. And
Yes.
She has my email address, and I'm happy to answer any further questions and just be a resource going forward for all of you.
Thank you. Well, there are a bunch of us who probably will do that.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for the invite. It's so heartening to see such a vibrant community here on a cold night like tonight, all gathered around.
Cold? What cold?
Thanks again, Brock.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Brock. That was great.
Thanks very much. Glad to
My
know.
goodness. Okay. I understand. Let's see, who's still here with us? Sandra? Sandra's here. I understand that nothing has been prepared about court cases to watch or recent. Is that true?
I can speak on that. We're still fine tuning the process. I met with NAMD before the meeting, and the city attorney's office is still pretty adamant of moving away from the person-focused court watch. We are getting data from MPD, and we're talking about bringing up locations, and also having making sure that big cases are touched on when we present in these meetings. So in March, we should have something to present on.
Okay.
It's
We'll be
almost
looking
there.
for it. If you would clue me in before the evening of, I'd appreciate it. And then we'll get a nice write-up to introduce it and take off with golden wings or something.
That sounds
Okay.
good.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It's something that, okay, crime in the neighborhood. State of the precinct. I did a little bit of homework. So per the MPD dashboard in the last 14 days, by the way, these numbers are very, very soft because reports have to get filed before they appear on the dashboard. But for the last 14 days in the second precinct, we had 4 domestic assaults divided between north and south, 8 burglaries of dwelling, 5 burglaries of business, 11 thefts or theft by swindle, 2 rapes, both in Marcy homes, 4 aggravated robberies, 2 north and 2 south. Then we had more than, I lost track of the counts because they're all piled on top of each other, but we had over 60 thefts of motor vehicles or motor vehicle parts. And I assume that many of those motor vehicle parts are catalytic converters. We had 12 thefts from motor vehicles, plus I heard a whole bunch of reports on Nextdoor about people just breaking into a car, not taking anything, but throwing people's possessions all over the front of the yard. On the other, on Smiley, we've got a little out of progress in bike thefts. There was only 1 bike theft in the last 14 days in all the second precinct. So, that said, I'm going to put out a plea also, because, well, crime is up, whatever it is, 40% or something, which considering that our police force is down 25%, that probably figures out pretty well. Plus, of course, people have lost their jobs, so they need money. Now, a bill revision was introduced to both the Minnesota House and Senate. And this is pertaining to catalytic converter thefts. The introduction to the bill reads in part, a bill for an act relating to public safety, establishing requirements for the purchase of catalytic converters. Because the fastest way perhaps to turn off theft is to close down the market. At least I'm sure that's the hope. Anyway, please contact your state representative and ask him or her to support HF 330. And Carrie Dijak is, I think, senator for all of us. And that is Senate SF 206. I'll repeat that. State representative, you ask them to support HF 330. And Carrie gets told about SF 206, and I'm sure she's already very familiar with it. And I will put the addresses. Do you want the addresses on the chat list so you can just copy and paste? Or do you have them? It's Sydney.Jordan@HouseMN, rep.Mohammed.Noor@HouseMN, or Carrie D, all small letters, @Senate.mn.
Maybe the inspector could tell us this, but what kind of apprehensions do they get of these converter thieves, and what exactly are they charged with, and what's the outcome in the court?
Hold on, sorry. Okay, sorry. Man, I'm fumbling with I've got my tiny little cell phone here. I keep hitting the button. I don't know.
Whoops.
It's so cold in my house here. Maybe that my fingers aren't even working. But anyway, great question, sir. Great question. Yeah, we are getting hammered. Emily, nice overview with the crime of the past 4 weeks. One thing that we should just touch on real quick is auto thefts. But let me first ask the gentleman, do my best to answer the gentleman's question. We do get some success in the second precinct, citywide, metro-wide, with recovery of stolen catalytic converters. We have had some success. I would have to lean on Numdy if he's on, just in terms of success, in terms of getting these suspects charged. We haven't been catching them in the act. I don't know if you saw the news story. I believe it was last week, where they're on the south side, there was a white tow truck or two, and they would pull up to a vehicle, and I couldn't believe how fast they could take that vehicle, lift it. It was like they backed up, lifted it, and they were gone. And then they just go a short distance while the vehicle is elevated on that tow truck, and they would get underneath it, cut the catalytic converter off, and then they're off and running. This is turning out to be a pretty lucrative kind of a side job, if you will, for these criminals. I mean, they're making a lot of money stealing these catalytic converters, particularly the ones from the hybrid vehicles. Numdy, are you on? Go ahead.
Yeah, Namdi isn't on, but I have a client who I just got from a catalytic converter ring, and he has a couple of felony charges for receiving stolen property and then possession of burglary tools. So
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Senator Dzik and Representative Jordan are very aware of we've been pushing for this new registration requirement and limiting these sales for the last year or so. There was a bill that was introduced last year because we gotta take off, approach it by aspect. I mean, it's just too difficult. We've gotten hit a lot in Como to catch these people in the act. Like Inspector Loaning said, it's so quick that it's by the time you call, I mean, they're already gone. So we got to start, limiting the purchase of these things by the suppliers. So I know they're both supportive, but I think that additional emails can help push this along. So
the problem with the cutting off the purchases of these things, like from the scrap dealers, though, is that these things are a high enough value. It's not like a bicycle that you might take to a pawn shop. These things are high enough value, so I load up a truck full of them and I take them to Missouri or wherever there's a market for them. So you have to understand that you might be able to choke off through record keeping, as we do with pawn shops, the easy sale of them, but there's an alternative to that, and the alternative is taking them somewhere else. And of course, there the problem is, so now we've got still have an enforcement problem and a risk management problem, in that making this so risky that if you do get caught doing it, maybe it's 10 years, and at that point, then the risk gets so high that you go on to something else with less risk involved.
Jim, I really think you ought to write that up and send it to Mohammed and Sidney and Kerry. I think they could use that input.
And one other thing to also consider is Councilmember Hofstad, before she left office, did a similar bill in the state. But the lobbying effort of the recycling industry was horrendous. It's a very strong lobbying group, and the bill was shot down during committee because they were looking at other recycling. At that time, we also had large copper thefts from buildings, and it was very hard to really track even the copper of, is it stolen, is it not stolen? Oh, I'm a contractor, this is leftover stuff, even though it looked brand new. And as the inspector said, one of the hard things to prove is, well, where did you get all these catalytic converters? Well, I found them on the railroad yard, or I found them. Can you prove that they were stolen? Well, no, you can't prove it because none of them are marked from vehicles. So it's a tougher picture than just saying, yeah, let's just cut them off from letting them be able to recycle the metals. There's a lot that really goes into finding these guys. Are they shipping them out of state? Are they in state? Metro Metals over off of 280 has been numerous times under the investigation of St. Paul police, and said some federal agencies for receiving stolen cars, and for stealing stolen property. There was even a story that St. Paul found out about a stolen vehicle that Metro Metals would crush a car within 20 minutes of them receiving it. And it was beating the police report to be even a stolen vehicle. So it is a very difficult process. And this is to really look at to see how do you mark a catalytic converter? How do you weld one to the bottom of your car? Can you engrave markings? Do you, we give out information for people. Unfortunately for the victim, you have to prove that it's your stolen merchandise or your stolen property, like a bike. If you see it online, let's say on a Craigslist and a bike for sale, and you say, that's my bike, and you come to us, you have to prove that it's your bike. And that's why we always, tell people, put a unique marking on the bike, on the snowblower. Cadillac converters are telling people to engrave something in their market so we can clearly see, and you can see that it is your item. So this is a very big deal. It's a quick crime. They can get quite a bit in a short amount of time, but it is tough to catch them in the act, and that's what we have to do to get them for the theft of the Cadillac. We have to catch them in the act,
and then start finding. Set up your decoy vehicles out there, and you might. It may be a labor-intensive operation. On the other hand, it's probably the only way that you're actually going to put a stop to it proactively. Other than that, I'm going to make a law is, but it doesn't work a lot of times, and this is one of them.
Sir, you had a great point about putting out a bait vehicle or a decoy vehicle. I love that idea. We do that with bikes. We do that with computers, cell phones, you name it, we're doing it. And we also have a pretty robust, within Minneapolis, a auto theft prevention bait vehicles that we use. And in the 2nd precinct one time, we had one deployed, and suspects actually cut the catalytic converter off that. Emily, don't document that in your paperwork.
Kind of embarrassing.
I mean, come on,
No, decoys work well because I was in your business for the first about 20 years of my working life. I used a few baits myself.
Okay.
Is the loss of the converter covered by your insurance on your vehicle? It's about $1,000 repair, I know, because mine just went out, and I was thinking maybe I should just leave the car on the street and maybe somebody would take it and I could get it replaced. But I thought, no, maybe that's just aiding and abetting. So
yeah, I think it is, Jim, because we did have a few people that have filed claims. It can be really dependent on the vehicle, on how much it costs. Like the Priuses they cost a lot more than, say, just a regular Honda Accord. But I was just wondering, Nick or Inspector Loining, if you had any updates on the that party house that has been a nuisance in Marcy Homes.
Was that a party house or was that a party apartment building?
It's a rental property.
So it's a house
on the lease.
There are only 2 houses on that block.
Yeah. Am I still muted?
No, you're good.
All right. So we have a particular house. It's a rental property at 1429 6th Street Southeast that has been problematic for us since the beginning of the year. We've had 2 parties since January 1st that have gone bad, real bad. Out of the 2 different incidents, one on January 1st and one here about 2 weekends ago, we've had shooting incidents at both parties. We've had a total of 5 people shot. Thank God it's all non-life threatening injuries, but we know how quickly things can go bad. It's not good. It is something we are working on. We're working on with regulatory services, business licensing. Nick Juarez has been very instrumental in working with the landlord And Nick, I don't know if you want to step in and just say a few things. Nick is very well versed, but Nick has been on this since day one, and we really appreciate all his work with this.
Yeah, we have been working with regulatory services, as the inspector has mentioned. Those are the people that issued the rental license. We're getting the property re-inspected. They're up for renewal in March, so it's not perfect timing, but it's timing where rental licensing can really look at the property and see kind of, do we renew the rental license? Do we put restrictions on the rental license as we move forward? We're working with the property
What did you
owner.
just say about the rental license before?
It's up for renewal. It's renewed every year, and so we'll do a
Oh,
rental inspection.
it's an annual inspection property?
No, the rental license is up for renewal. So, but this time we found out that this hasn't been inspected in a while. So it gives a chance for rental licensing to get in there before the renewal to do a complete housing inspection. We work with the property owner and the management company, and they're doing their best to resolve this issue, going through the court process for an eviction. It's just housing court is just it's a little slow at this time, so we're just waiting on the process. But they are aware of the situation. They've been doing their own kind of drive-bys of the property to make sure that there hasn't been anything happening over the weekend. They let the tenants know that they're actively pursuing remedies to get them evicted out of the property so they get their property back. So the process has started, and I would just have to wait and just make sure that everything is done by the book for the property owner to get their property back. So it's an ongoing process. Everybody's working.
So if
Mercy Homes Neighborhood Association weighed in on any of this?
Not really, no.
Nick, nice job explaining all that. Thank you so much. I just want to add that we, along with University of Minnesota, have really been providing a lot of strong presence in that block, in that neighborhood, showing our support and trying to deter any additional violence, any parties from starting up. As a matter of fact, we've gotten to the point, we're not harassing anybody. We're just doing our job. We're doing our job, and we're working with the landlord, and they're saying, listen, we need extra patrol. And that's what we're doing. We're just high visibility. That over the last weekend, people from that rental property came outside and were angry at the officers, saying, why are you guys always here in the area? Why, and again, we're not singling anybody out. We're not picking on anybody, but we have a public safety problem here. We really do. And I'll tell you, I'm trying to show incredible restraint right now. Let me just say this. Our investigative unit, along with the patrol staff, have done such a nice job working on these two different incidents, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, case follow-up investigations. I will tell you that we have had success with this most recent shooting incident, but I can't go into depth with how much success. I'm so sorry. I wish I talked to Nick earlier, and I did not think this house was going to come up. So I really didn't. I did not think it was going to come up, but yeah, we're telling you what we can tell you, but we've had a lot of success with the investigation, and we're hoping to get something out to the community. I was hoping before the end of last week, but the investigative lieutenant that oversees the assault unit did not let me know if they were able to finalize a court process, if that makes sense. So
looking for it in the paper.
Something out as soon as we can. It's so stupid. And right now I feel like it's almost like some kid in the kindergarten, I know something, but I can't tell you. And I'm sorry. Just all I can tell you, we have been so committed to this, and we're so concerned about everybody's safety, and we don't want another incident. We absolutely do not. This rental property, these are not U of M students that are renting there. This house nestled right in the midst of all of the U of M rental properties and stuff, and it's not good. It is not good, and we are working on getting these people evicted. Nick is working on that, and we'll see how that goes. So please be patient with us. But know this: it's not like it happens and we just say, trust me, it is focus time and a lot of energy in Mercy Homes, not just in that block, in Marcy Homes, because we've had, last week we had 2 carjackings, one in Marcy Homes, one up at 800 block of Lowry. So yeah, it is something that we're most certainly working on diligently. So.
Well, as an alternative, I can tell you that 2 people helped me shovel my 55-foot sidewalk this so far in the last snowstorm. And we have had a party of our own with snow shovels. Just to finish this whole thing up on a good note, I can tell you I have good neighbors in Southeast Como. So we can all enjoy that. I believe you can enjoy it. Yes, exactly. Okay, that takes care of the agenda. And please, if you have any more questions you want to go to Mr. Hunter, please let me know what they are in the next day or so. Because, well, I know I had a cousin who was a Vietnam nurse. I have friends who fought in Vietnam. I have friends who fought in Iraq. I'm kind of tired of this. I'm a mess here. So thank you all for coming. Please get the questions to me to forward. And Todd, I will be looking for your news in the Star Tribune, right?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We are, yes, much success. And we're not done. So
Nick, watch him, will you?
Great.
what you say?
You can watch Nick if you want. I don't care. Just so we can find a solution to this whole thing.
We will, yeah.
Yes.
Inspector, thank you and your entire team at the 2nd Precinct for your continued service to our community. We appreciate you.
Thank you all. Yes.
Get after it, devil dog.
Thanks for decades of help.
Yep. There you go.
Thank you, everyone. Great work, as always.
Cody, meet me.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily, and thank you everyone there.
Thanks all for coming.